From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Face the State on the Montana Television Network. I'm Mike Dennison, MTN's chief political reporter. Well, it's now week 10 of the Montana legislature and lawmakers are starting to zero in on how they're going to resolve the big outstanding issues, most of which involve a lot of money. We have the state's $10.4 billion two-year budget, whether to continue Medicaid expansion, which is $1.5 billion over the next 2 years, and multi-million-dollar proposals for building infrastructure projects, big and small, all across the state. We have about 6 weeks remaining for legislators and Governor Steve Bullock to wrap things up. This morning, we'll take a closer look at how that might happen. Joining me for our show today are two leading lawmakers from each side of the political aisle. Republican State Representative Eric Moore from Miles City, who's a member of the State House Appropriations Committee, and Democratic Senate Minority Leader John Sesso of Butte. Thank you for joining us this morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Let's start out with the state budget, the main budget bill, which the House Appropriations Committee approved last week. And as we said, you're a member of the committee, and all the Republicans, I believe, voted for the bill to send House Bill 2 to the floor this coming week. Why did all Republicans vote for that bill? What's to like about it, and why did you send it forward?
Well, we think House Bill 2 is in fairly decent shape right now, Mike. It's as it currently sits, it's going to be about a 3 to 3.5% increase over the last biennium's appropriations. Republicans have said from the get-go that our goal is to fund essential services, try to keep growth of state government in relation to growth of the private sector, so that's inflation and population, and not create any new taxes. So I think House Bill 2 is certainly not obese. Personally, I think it could stand to lose a few pounds, much like myself. But no, I think it's a decent product going forward. There's several more bites at the apple. The House floor has to look at it. Senate Finance and Claims has to look at it, and we're in negotiations with the executive on some of their concerns. But I think we've got a good product so far at this point in this session.
Now, as Representative Moore mentioned, there's a lot left to be done on House Bill 2. It's on the House floor this week, then it comes over to the Senate, to your end of things. What are some things that Democrats look at that bill and say, something's missing here?
Well, we'll have to see. I can't disagree with my colleague on how it looks right now. Decent. You know, I think that there's a couple holes. It's my understanding, however, that the holes that we see, like on pre-K, some of the special ed funding, some of the other issues, there are separate policy bills that we're going to attach revenue to. So we hope to, as a package between House Bill 2 and these other policy bills, we should be able to shore things up. Of course, you know, the challenge is always balancing out the revenues we take in with the what we call present law adjustment, but basically it's the inflation of doing business as a state, and we got to make sure it trues up. When it's a shortfall, you know, we've got to make some serious cuts, or we got to try to raise some revenue. So we'll be looking at the last revenue estimate we get in, you know, late March, early April, gives us the final snapshot on the best we can predict on how much revenue we'll take in from all the traditional sources, and then we'll true that up with the budget. You know, it's a little bit difficult this year because we had the special session. We had to make some serious cuts in the 17 session. So a lot of the work the Appropriations Committee has done and the House folks after subcommittees was to true up, you know, the restoration of the base budget with what we're going to do with the present law adjustment and the increase, the inflation for 20 and 21. We're always out there 18, 24, 30 months, and so it's a difficult hustle to try to get it all put together. But there's some holes. There's certainly some of the departments that took a little greater hit than they probably wanted to. But you know, I share my colleagues' view that our job is to make sure the budget is within our means, right. And we'll, like we always do, unlike our National Congress, we have a constitutional requirement to balance it up, yeah. And we'll do it, and we'll get it done again this year.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of steps left to go, and it's coming over to your side, and we pretty much know what it's going to look like, but it could have changed a little bit in the coming weeks.
It sure
or so.
can.
Yeah, and now one thing that Senator Sesso mentioned was the preschool, the governor's preschool program is not in the budget, yet you plan to sponsor an alternative to that. Tell us about the bill that you plan to sponsor and how it differs from the governor's proposal.
Sure. Part of the reason that we cut the funding from House Bill 2 is that I think most of us feel that this is a policy decision. When the governor first introduced pre-K, I think in the 2015 session, it wasn't a policy bill, it was just a chunk of money in House Bill 2. This is a policy consideration that should be considered by the whole legislature. So yes, I'm bringing a policy bill. A lot of the work we did in the interim, those of us on appropriations and finances, we looked at best practices across the country. The infrastructure bill, which we'll talk about it in a minute, came a lot of what's been done in Utah and has been successful. So with pre-K, we looked at other states that have implemented this, that have done it successfully and are showing some positive results. And the state that stands out is Alabama, which is a very red state politically, very conservative. So I actually went down there over the interim and met with some people and studied, and I was pretty impressed with what I saw.
Well.
We went with the governor. Yep, went with the governor. So my wife's been a preschool provider for years in the private sector. I believe that there's a lot more about early brain development and brain science that we know more now than we did even 10 years ago. So the policy bill that I will be bringing for consideration for the legislature will be a school choice model, a money follow the student, where K-12 districts, Head Start providers, local providers can all apply for block grant funding from the state. There will be input metrics that will be set so that we can assure that we're delivering, a high quality product across the state. So we'll run it past the legislature here in the next couple weeks and see what people think.
And Senator Sesso, of course, you haven't seen the bill yet, but do you think does this sound like something Democrats could support? Because I'm sure we're going to need some Democratic votes to pass it. I don't think all the Republicans are going to vote for it.
Well, I think we've got to work hard to find the sweet spot between the provision of preschool, pre-K, pre-kindergarten, from a private, more private model versus a public model. I think our objectives are to make sure it's available to everyone, and you know, I got to believe that we can figure out a model that works. It does not abandon, because there are a lot of preschool providers in this state that do great work. They provide a great service not only to the families and the children that they serve, but that whole business of letting our kids have a head start. Now, we just got to make sure that model is available to all Montanans, because that's the goal. That's the objective, is to make sure that all our kids get a fresh and a head start. Otherwise, we're going to lose. I'm glad to hear that there's more majority party support for the concept this year than there has been in the past, because, you know, we're one of just a handful of states now that don't do this, yeah. And you know, our kids are just going to come out of the gate behind if we don't provide this for them. But you know, as always, the governor has shown some leadership, and it's very important to him that we get this done, and so we're committed to working with all the ideas. We look forward to seeing Representative Moore's bill when it comes out, how that comports with what the governor has put out there already, and we got to find that sweet spot to balance out all the providers that do a great job with the need to provide it for everybody.
And do you think the Republican votes are there enough to support this? I mean, I assume it has to be a bipartisan support for this bill. Is that your assumption?
Well, I think, Mike, you said it accurately. I think there's going to be more Democrat support for it, assuming we can find a compromise, as Senator Sesso said. Yeah, but there's Republican support for it. Okay. If you look nationwide, it is certainly not a partisan issue. You don't see preschool provided in just blue states across the nation. Like I said, Alabama's a leader, and they're certainly more red than this state is.
Okay. I want to come back to something that Senator Sesso mentioned when we were talking about the budget, and this was some departments are saying that some of their personnel have been cut. And for instance, Department of Public Health and Human Services was objecting strenuously, you know, in the last week or so about having 100 positions or so cut. Tell us about why that decision was made and why you think it was a good decision and where that money went that was saved by making those cuts.
Sure. So I did chair the Section B subcommittee this session on Health and Human Services. Let's just throw out some base numbers. About 3,000 employees in the Department of Health and Human Services, or full-time positions. 400 of them are currently vacant. 100 of those have been vacant for over a year. So the subcommittee looked at those positions and said, maybe there's a better way. And a lot of these positions, that's not a reflection on the department, because a lot of these positions are hard to fill. Voc rehab, developmentally disabled, child protective workers, all hard work, not always pleasant work. But we thought that if there's 100 vacant positions that have been vacant for over a year and services are still being provided, that's a good place to trim down some money. There's no sense in funding empty slots, and the subcommittee took a lot of that money and put it towards provider rates, some of which were cut a lot by the 17-7-140 cuts in the 17 special sessions. So we tried to put some money back into the communities, back towards provider rates, and what we encouraged the department was, if we're having trouble filling certain positions, child protective workers, classic example, let's have that conversation. Why can we not hire these people? Do we need to talk about base pay? I'm actually bringing a bill that is providing for tuition reimbursement for people who go into child protective services, like we do with hard to fill teaching areas. So I think that's more of a conversation that we need to be having, as opposed to how many empty slots do we want to fund.
Now, I know the governor has made it clear that his administration is not like that. I'm wondering, how did your caucus feel about losing some of those positions and having the money shipped to the community, as Representative Moore said? Is this something you guys are going to go to the mat on, or what?
Well, it's a balancing act. There's no question about it. I happen to believe that the director, I have a lot of faith in Director Hogan at the department. I think she made a conscious effort to use the dollars that Representative Moore speaks about with those positions that were left open to avoid having to come back to us with a supplemental. You know, typically over my time, this is my 8th session, and typically, you know, the Department of Health, it's really a balancing act. There's so much money there, as you said in your opening. It's a $1.5 billion program, and then on top of that is a whole bunch of federal money. So it's you know, more money in certain areas, other money in other areas. I think we need to give the department the flexibility to, and as I think was pointed out by Representative Moore, I think that they got to have some flexibility to fill holes on the left when there's a surplus on the right. And I just would have probably defended it a little bit differently, that where the money went in your question, the money went into the programs, and you know, the bottom line is she didn't come with a supplemental this year. The whole department, this is a big department, not having a supplemental is a very, very strong management move on her part. As far as getting money to the communities, spending money on services versus administration, no quarrel there. I think that across the board, Democrat, Republican alike, we want money to provide services to Montanans. And to whatever extent we can maximize that, the better.
Okay. Now, before we leave the budget and go on to some other things, let's talk about revenue, which is going to be a discussion here in these closing weeks. The governor is going to have several proposals to tax things like tobacco, liquor, lodging, I believe, investment advisors. Do you think some of these things are needed to balance the budget? Don't we have enough revenue, perhaps, to balance things without imposing any of these taxes?
Until I see the budget and what was cut in the Senate when we get the product, and then I see the revenue estimates coming down the stretch, I can't answer. I think that, let me just be clear, the Democrats and the Republicans, nobody wants to raise taxes. I mean, it's just not what we want to do. But at the same time, you gotta meet the needs of Montanans. And if we can meet the needs with our existing resources and have a healthy operating reserve, so if the economy tanks and we don't get the revenues we anticipate, we've got a buffer there so that we do not have to go back into a special session again, et cetera. Then let's do it without raising any more revenue. I got to see what's been cut, though, and how much money will be left in the bank when we're all said and done. And if we can do that without raising any revenues, more power to us. I think that's what we come to do, is to satisfy the needs, the priorities of our state and our citizens. And we should rely on the revenue sources we already have, and make sure that we've counted it up right and we've predicted properly on how much we're going to take in over the next 30 months, and do the best we can. To the extent we can, and we have to leave critical needs on the sidelines, well then I've done this before, I have to challenge my counterpart to identify where those cuts need to come from.
Yeah. You can certainly answer that question, but first I want to ask you something related to that. And the Republican leadership has said no new taxes, period. And I mean, isn't that kind of a simplistic stance? I mean, why shouldn't we be talking about what taxes we may be imposing and what they're going to pay for, rather than just saying no right off the bat to taxes?
Well, because we're Republicans, that's what we do. No, but all kidding aside, we don't believe that we have a revenue problem. We believe we have a spending problem, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. If you talk to local property taxpayers in my districts, in rural districts, taxes are through the roof. Our income tax is not quite as egregious, but there's fees, there's property taxes, we put a gas tax in last session. Now, if we want to have the conversation, there's not enough time to do it this session, about how we touch more of the tourist industry, how we broaden our tax base so that we are touching more people and not overly punishing the achievers and the property owners, to keep the initial tax rates the same, but maybe hitching our wagon to something that shows a higher growth potential in the future. I think we're all willing to have that conversation, but increasing taxes on the current payers, I think, is a non-starter for Republicans. And I might add one thing in response to my good friend and colleague across the aisle. When we talk about cuts, we're talking about cuts to the governor's proposal. No, I don't know of any agency that's been cut spend from the last biennium to spend this biennium.
The amount of increases.
We're talking about a decrease in the increase, right? That's very different than a cut.
Yeah, okay. What he said about, whatever, what do you want to call it, a cut or reduction, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the budget director, when he was testifying before your committee within the last week or so, he said, look, if we're going to cut something or scale back something, I don't want it to just be across the board. I want you and us to identify specific programs we don't need anymore. What's your view on that? Do you think that's a good approach to take? And if so, where do we go?
No, I don't accept his premise, because if we were actually looking at the legislature, came to the executive and said, we are going to cut 5% from the budget this year, not 5% under what the governor requests, but 5% less than what we spent last year, then that's a fair question to have. But as I said in my opening, the budget is inflation plus population. I mean, we are increasing spending along with the growth of the economy. There's certain pockets of state government. Child Protective Services is the one that we keep coming back to because of the methamphetamine epidemic, the epidemic of DN cases that we're seeing. We have to readjust our spending priorities in certain areas, but we should also be getting more efficiencies with technology. We shouldn't need as much paperwork. We shouldn't need as much administration. We shouldn't need as much mid-level managers because of technology that all businesses enjoy. So we ought to be able to find efficiencies there and reallocate spending to where the needs truly are.
Okay. Let's move on to another big topic, Medicaid expansion, which of course is one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue before the session. And it's about a $1.5 billion program over the next 2 years, which covers 96,000 low-income Montanans. Senator Sesso, Democrats and the governor have been hammering away on their message that no real changes are needed to this very successful program. The work requirements are probably counterproductive. I mean, do you really think a bill is going to get through with Republican votes if it doesn't have work requirements? Isn't that something that really has to be in there for it to pass?
Well, I am still going to be an advocate of the status quo. I thought we did a great job in 2015. We built a good product, a Montana-made solution to provide this coverage to these 96,000 Montanans, our neighbors, our families, our friends. The businesses in Montana have enjoyed the benefits of this expansion. the amount of dollars that have come into our economy, $500 million, the 5,000 jobs that have been created, the stabilization of our rural hospitals. I think the evidence of the product we passed in 2015 overwhelms any need to change. Now, one of the things we did in 2015 was Help Link. It was part of the HELP Act, and that was to connect jobs, connect employment with the recipients of this benefit. I think we got off to a good start. We're rounding first, maybe on our way to second, maybe there already on how to make that connection. I don't think there's any disagreement, Democrats, Republicans, that if you're enjoying a benefit from the state of Montana and you have the ability to work, you should be working and to a certain extent earning that benefit. But we also have a premium, we have a copay in the product we passed in 2015. We have a buy-in, we have skin in the game among these people. And so my response is, hey, I think that there's always room for improvement on the good idea that we put together in 2015, making sure employment, ability to work is connected to the recipients. Now, our challenge is to figure out a way to do that that is not overly burdensome on the bureaucracy. We're not going to, certainly the legislature is not wanting to create bureaucratic jobs just to make sure we're imposing work requirements. So again, it's up to us to work together to make sure that the product we leave with, because I have found that there are enough votes in the legislature to pass a continuation of the bill we passed in 2015. I remind everybody all the time that we put that sunset in. One is to take a look at how well the program worked, but the main reason we put that sunset in was to make sure the federal government held up their end. You know, their shares going down from 98 to 97, 95, 93, and it's going to flatten out at 90 in 2020. We didn't know, quite frankly, we couldn't trust that in 2015. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't pass something that was not sustainable. It has turned out to be very good for the state of Montana, for the people we're covering, for the hospitals, for particularly the rural hospitals, and for the citizens that we need to get a hand up. Our goal as Democrats is to make sure the people who are on Medicaid expansion don't have to be there. Give them a job or give them new training so they can get a better job, because a lot of the people are working hard. Many, many people of those 96,000 are working. They have 1, 2 jobs and they still qualify under that poverty level. We got to help them up.
Representative Moore, I believe you voted against Medicaid expansion 4 years ago.
I recall I did, yes.
Yes, and
spoke against it.
Yeah, and what's it going to take to get you to vote for it this year, if you are?
So a couple major takeaway points on Medicaid expansion. I don't disagree with much of what Senator Sesso said, but we do live in a different world than we did in 2015. Number one, we have a new president. We have a new Center for Medicaid Services, so there are different waivers allowed. A popular misconception that I hear from my constituents is, well, why didn't you do this in Medicaid? Why didn't you do that in Medicaid? This is federal funds that has to be permitted by a waiver till we get the federal funds. So we are limited as a state in what we can do. But we do have we have work requirements, which we didn't have in 2015 under the Obama administration. The second thing is, like it or not, we live in a post-I-185 world, and we can attribute the defeat of I-185 to the tobacco tax, to the amount of money that was spent, or to what it is. But the citizens, to some degree, have spoken about at least what they feel about paying for Medicaid with the tobacco tax. That being said, I fully agree with Senator Sesso. Our biggest question with this program is this a transitional population that is moving towards self-sufficiently, or have we just created another class of permanent entitlement? And I'm not sure the data is conclusive enough to decide that one way or another. So that being said, to get around to your question, I think a work requirement, not a recommendation, is an absolute requirement for me, and I think most Republicans. I think we have to talk about an asset test. I think there are people who have substantial property wealth in this state who don't legally receive any income who are eligible. And I think we're after the same subclassification of people in this program. I mean, we're certainly not talking about the people who are frail. We're not talking about students. We're not talking about people homebound giving care to an invalid loved one. We are talking about able-bodied, working-age adults without any other things that are preventing them from working. And what is that population? Is it 5%, 20%, 30%? I don't think we really know, but I think it's our duty to the taxpayers to isolate these people and either get them on the road to self-sufficiency to work, or at a last cause, boot them off. And I think that has to be part of the package.
Okay. We've got about 3 minutes left in the show here. I want to get to infrastructure, and another one of the big issues. And of course, the Republicans just introduced their infrastructure bonding bill last week, which has about, I believe, $80 million of bonding in it. Can tell us about that proposal and why Republicans see that as a good alternative to the governor's proposal?
Well, we think it's a reasonable effort at infrastructure. It fits within the parameters of the IDEA Act that passed unanimously out of the House in terms of setting a bonding level for state debt. It's a good mixture of state buildings and local infrastructure. So we hope that we can get it over the hump this time. We're hoping that setting a structure and reasonable, responsible fiscal limits to our general obligation debt is going to help ease enough minds so we can get this thing over the hump finally.
And of course, it needs 2/3 majority in each house to pass.
Right.
And Senator Sesso, you've been a big proponent of getting some infrastructure bonding passed this session. What do you think of the GOP bill that just came out last week? Have you had a chance to take a look at it much? And how do you feel about it compared to what Democrats have been advocating for?
Well, we have on infrastructure been very bipartisan over these last 2 months. We worked hard together on building these products. Quite frankly, I think that the governor's proposal was pretty good coming out of the gate. But, he proposes and we dispose, and as a legislature, we wanted to put our stamp on it. Representative Moore has shown the leadership to get that infrastructure policy bill done. Got great support in the House. I think that'll be well received in the Senate. That gives everybody comfort that we're not just shooting in the dark. We're not just putting a list of projects together this year and then next year what are we going to do? There is now a policy that we're passing that guides us on infrastructure development long into the future. Very important. As far as the projects this time, to a certain extent, it's my hope that save for a few less dollars going to that grant program for oil and gas in coal country, I think that we're going to try to get all of the proposals, all of the projects done that were in the governor's bill. So I think we've worked well together, and I have high hopes that we're going to get that done this time.
Okay, very quickly, Republicans have the majority. They can pass whatever they want. They can block whatever they want. What do Democrats or the governor have as a card they can play, say, hey, this is what we're going to go to the mat on? Anything?
Well, the governor's got the veto pen, so he uses that pretty deftly, and that's one thing we've got, because a lot of priorities that the Republicans have require his approval, and everybody has to work together. I have made my career in the legislature, working on both sides and making sure that everybody's in on the decisions, and we use our influence however we can.
I'm going to stop you there. I just want to ask Representative Moore if there's one thing Republicans really want to get out of the session that we haven't talked about or that we have talked about.
No, I think the bigger issues are what we've talked about. I think Republicans will be happy with no new taxes and a lean budget. Okay, great. Well, thank both of you gentlemen for joining us this morning on Face the State. We'll be back later this year at the end of the legislature to hash things out. And of course, MTN will be providing full coverage of the final 6 weeks of the session. Thank you and good morning.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.
We are always